Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to McKenna Hall for this inaugural public lecture here in the auditorium of the newly opened McKenna Hall about a month ago. This is the first event that is not admissions related to take place in this space. So let's give ourselves a hand for being here. All right. My name is Father Paul Coleman. I'm a theology faculty member and a member of the area in our department we call World Religions World Church. The World Religions World Church area joins the other areas of our department: history of Christianity, systematic theology.
I didn't run away.
Which is a Bible area, liturgy, and ethics. Is one of the 6 areas that constitutes the range of subjects we. It's a privilege to work with my colleagues across the department in our area. And it is this area that has sponsored a conference which started yesterday afternoon, which will continue through noon tomorrow. And this is our keynote presentation for the conference. So I welcome you on behalf of myself and Professor Gabriel Reynolds, co-organizer of this conference with me, and its inspiration several years ago when he thought of the idea of having a conference around this. Also assisting us in a very important way was Professor Alison Fitchett-Climenhaga, who's in Melbourne, Australia, but a graduate of our department and is there with her husband teaching at Australian Catholic University. So we're real grateful for the support that Alison, Professor Fitchett-Climenhaga, has been able to provide us as well. The papers we've heard starting yesterday afternoon and continuing all day today have already been a rich buffet of kind of entrees into, I better stop the meal metaphors, into the topic of sanctification and holiness across religious traditions. We've heard from colleagues who've spoken about Judaism and Islam, Buddhism and Christianity, Asia and Africa, and we'll hear tomorrow about Latin America. It's been a rich conference already, and we look forward to tonight's keynote speaker. Very excited that she's come to join us here at Notre Dame for the conference and for tonight's talk. Conferences like this don't happen with a lot of important help from various units of the university. I'd like to particularly highlight the work of the Communications Office, College of Arts and Letters, Kate Gary, who oversees that office, and graphic designer Heidi Henke. Also, the Office of Institute for Scholarship and the Liberal Arts that sponsors conferences, at least till recently in the College of Arts and Letters, has supported us. Henceforth, they're going to be reorganizing and organizing conferences in a different way, but we've been very appreciative for the support we received from that office, especially Kristen Garvin-Podell, who has been just pivotal in putting this conference together. Originally, this event was supposed to have taken place in March 2020. So now, 18 months later, here we are, and we're so grateful to be able to gather together and to have these rich days of intellectual exchange in a setting like this, a beautiful new space on our beautiful campus. So welcome, everyone. To introduce our speaker, I'd like to introduce another colleague in the World Religions World Church area of the theology department, Professor Brad Malkowski. Professor Brad Malkowski has been at Notre Dame for about 25 years. Just 30 years. Professor Malkowski is an extremely popular student and colleague, a distinguished scholar of Christianity and Hinduism. I remember talking to him about some of the issues I encountered studying Hinduism, and his questions for me are always, why don't you care about the theology of Hindus? Because I talked about things like gender relations or historical particularities or economic systems. He says, why don't you talk about the theological belief of Hindus? Brad is a theologian to his soles of his feet to the top of his head, and a very distinguished friend and colleague, and I'm glad to introduce him to introduce our keynote speaker.
Very nice. Is this on? So everyone, I timed it. It's going to be about 3 minutes, this introduction, okay? Just so you know. So I am honored to introduce our keynote speaker this evening. Dr. Catherine Cornille is internationally known as a leading voice in the disciplines of comparative theology, the theology of religions, and interreligious dialogue. She has been teaching in the theology department at Boston College since 2005. At Boston College, she holds the Newton College Alumni Chair of Western Culture. She is originally from Belgium, and she earned her PhD in religious studies from Louvain in 1989 with a dissertation called The Guru in Indian Catholicism. This became her first published book. Dr. Cornille was subsequently appointed, are you ready? She was subsequently appointed the first female professor at the University of Louvain in 500 years. In addition, at Boston College, she was the first female chair in the history of the Department of Theology. Dr. Cornille is, in addition, a prolific author. She has written 8 books and edited 12 more. Her recent publications include Meaning and Method in Comparative Theology, 2020, and most recently, just a few weeks ago, her edited book appeared called Comparative Theology and Atonement: The Cross in Dialogue with Other Religions, Fordham University Press. Her 2008 book, The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue, is quoted by just about everyone working in the field of interreligious engagement. Other books include Women and Interreligious Dialogue and the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Interreligious Dialogue. She is also founding editor-in-chief of the book series Christian Commentaries on Non-Christian Sacred Texts. She has also published countless articles on a wide range of themes, with 6 more articles expected to appear in 2022. I think her work can best be characterized as commitment to her Catholic tradition combined with openness to other religions. One of the most notable things about Dr. Cornille is that she is not only a first-rate scholar and thinker, she is also a wonderful and engaging speaker. She is always a clear communicator and therefore very much in demand around the world. She has been invited to speak at Notre Dame multiple times in the past, and she will be here again a year from now to speak at a conference on the perennial philosophy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Catherine Cornille, whose talk this evening is called A Saint for All Times and Traditions, Meister Eckhart Across Religions.
Thank you so much, Brett, and thank you all for coming at this late hour. I know for those of us who have been at the conference, it's been a full day and then another talk in the evening. I'm sure you had other ideas for things to do this evening. Thanks to all the students who are here. Thanks to colleagues who came from the Department of Theology. It's really an honor to be here again. And I'm very grateful, I have to say, for the opportunity to give this lecture, and very grateful for the opportunity to focus on Meister Eckhart's thought. I have to admit that I'm not at all an expert in Meister Eckhart, and the reason I broached this topic was that in comparative theology, there's always a tendency to look at what Christians can learn from other religious traditions. And so I was interested in Meister Eckhart because there's no Christian thinker in the history of theology that has garnered as much interest from other religious traditions as Meister Eckhart. And so I wanted to look at how he has been used by thinkers from other religious traditions, what the kind of processes were, what was of interest to theologians from other religious traditions, and so forth. But in the process of preparing this paper and doing the slow reading of Eckhart's own sermons, I have to say, nothing in my whole career has been as spiritually uplifting and meaningful to me as the opportunity to read his work slowly and intently. So I'm very grateful for that also. Thank you for the organizers, and thank you for the honor of giving this keynote lecture. So first of all, Meister Eckhart actually was never officially canonized in the Catholic Church, but it is, of course, true that all of his writings are about the life of holiness. So in that sense, holiness or saintliness is really at the heart of Meister Eckhart's work. And his writings have been quoted and admired, appropriated by Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Jews. Not that all the people that I will be mentioning in this lecture are necessarily representative of their own tradition. That might be an immediate comeback, that the people who use Meister Eckhart are of a particular ilk in their own tradition. They tend to be mystics themselves. But for example, in the Buddhist tradition, I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Japanese Kyoto school of Buddhism. Just about all of the thinkers in that school have used Meister Eckhart in one or the other way. In the Hindu tradition, Ananda Kumaraswamy, Radhakrishnan have been big fans of Meister Eckhart. In the Jewish tradition, Martin Buber. In the Muslim tradition, Fritjof Schuon. Meister Eckhart has been sort of the favorite Christian theologian that has been quoted by perennial theologians also. So all over the place, we see references to Meister Eckhart and different ways in which he has been used. Of course, Meister Eckhart himself was also, during his time, influenced by thinkers from other religious traditions. So, of course, he didn't know Hinduism and Buddhism, but Islam was, of course, part of the cultural ambiance in which he developed his thought. And Maimonides, for example, the Jewish thinker, apparently, according to McGinn, only Augustine is quoted more often than Maimonides in Meister Eckhart's thought. So very strong influence from Jewish thinkers, and also Averroes, Avicenna are all quoted by Eckhart himself in his work. He refers to them as heathen masters, usually in his work. Meister Eckhart himself, of course, during his life was not uncontroversial. So at the end of his life, many of his articles were investigated first by his fellow Dominicans and then by a papal investigation, and were ultimately, posthumously, he was condemned of 28 articles, some of which I will be quoting. But nevertheless, Eckhart has continued to exercise a very important influence in the Christian tradition also. His own disciples, Tauler and Suso, carried on his thought. In the 19th century, German romantics revived his thought. But it's probably mostly in the late 19th century and in the 20th century that the very fact of the similarities between Meister Eckhart and other religious traditions is what has really ignited or reignited a real interest in Eckhart. And one of the first to notice these similarities was Schopenhauer, who in his The World as Will and Representation compares the Buddha's teaching to Eckhart's and to his own. And he quotes, "Buddha, Eckhart, and I teach essentially the same thing. Eckhart in the fetters of his Christian mythology. These same thoughts are found in Buddhism, though not stunted by any such mythology, and therefore simple and clear, to the extent that a religion can be clear. With me, his thought attains its full clarity," he quotes. But many Christian thinkers have also sort of found Eckhart again. And one of the most interesting one is Thomas Merton, of course, a very famous Christian theologian and mystic in the 20th century. He really, it seems, has come to rediscover Eckhart also through his reading of D.T. Suzuki. So again, a Buddhist teacher. So all of this is quite interesting. Most of you probably also know Rudolf Otto has a very famous work in which he compares Eckhart with Shankara. In fact, mostly uses Shankara, the Hindu philosopher, as a foil to vindicate Eckhart, but still that also has sort of put Eckhart again in the center of attention. So what I would like to do here in this lecture is sort of focus on what are the main ideas of Meister Eckhart that these thinkers of other religions have borrowed from or have found interesting and have latched onto. So I will focus on three main topics, namely his idea of non-duality, his apophaticism, and his understanding of detachment. I think these are the three main topics that have been of particular interest across religious traditions, and I will go through each of them first, and then I will ask the question, what does this mean for our understanding, first of Eckhart himself, and then of sainthood across religious traditions? What does that tell us about sainthood as a whole? And then finally, also, what can it mean for us as Christians that Meister Eckhart is so popular across religious traditions? So those are the three questions we will be asking. But first, I will go through some of the main themes or the main topics that have been of interest across religious traditions. And first, the theme of non-duality. So the term non-duality can be understood in many different ways and has been understood in different ways in different religious traditions. But in Meister Eckhart, it has to do with the idea that the ground of the soul is no different from the ground of the divine reality. So the ground of the soul is the same or non-different from the ground of God. Bernard McGinn refers to Meister Eckhart as the mystic of the Grund, or the ground. So he always focuses on this notion of the ground and on the fact that the ground, the deepest ground of one's own soul, is one with the ground of God. God's ground and the soul's ground is one ground. And I will go show you a few quotes here that I have put up so that you don't just have to listen to me, but I will read them. The soul seeks to know whence this being comes. It wants to get into the simple ground, into the silent desert into which no distinction ever peeped, or Father or Son or Holy Ghost. In the inmost part where none is at home, there that light finds satisfaction, and there it is more one than it is in itself. So the idea of the deepest ground in which it is one with God. That's in Sermon 48. So most of the quotes that I use are from his Middle High German sermons. I don't use his Latin work so much. I think these are probably more representative and have been more used also by other religious traditions. Here's another quote from one of his sermons. For this breaking through guarantees to me that I and God are one. So he also uses the metaphor of breakthrough to the ground. And so in this breakthrough, I and God are one. And then finally, a very famous quote, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, and one love. So here you get a taste of his notion of non-duality, which is really a constant refrain throughout all of his sermons. Okay, so that's how Eckhart understands non-duality. Now, how has he been used by other religious traditions? First, we can take a look at Hinduism. And of course, the notion of the non-duality of the self and God is one that resonates very directly with Hindu notions of the non-duality or non-dualism of Atman, the deepest soul, which is non-dual or one with Brahman, the ultimate reality itself. So already from the earliest Upanishads, the most ancient texts of Hinduism, there is mention that my deepest self is Brahman, or my deepest self is God, or Tattvam Asi is a famous refrain that comes up in the Chandogya Upanishad, that art thou, you are that ultimate reality. So the idea of non-duality gave rise in the Hindu tradition to a philosophical school that's usually attributed to Shankara. And so people in that tradition have recognized very eagerly the similarities between Eckhart and the idea and the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, is the school of non-duality. So Ananda Coomaraswamy is a relatively recent exemplar of that school, and he says, quote, Eckhart presents an astonishingly close parallel to Indian modes of thought. Some whole passages and many single sentences read like a direct translation from Sanskrit. It is not, of course, suggested that any Indian elements, whatever, are actually present in Eckhart's writing, though there are some Oriental factors in the European tradition derived from Neoplatonic and Arab sources. But what is proved by analogies is not the influence of one system of thought upon another, but the coherence of the metaphysical tradition in the world and at all times. So that's Ananda Coomaraswamy. Radhakrishnan says something similar, but I won't go through all of the quotes that I have also in my paper. That gives you an idea of how Hindus have used Meister Eckhart. Then going to the Buddhist tradition, and in particular the school of the Kyoto school of Buddhism. Here, the emphasis is slightly different. So it's not so much the idea of the highest reality and the deepest self. In Buddhism, there is no notion of God that's analogous to Christianity, but it's more the Mahayana idea that samsara, or this world of transience, is no different from the ultimate reality itself. So this is where we realize the truth of the emptiness of reality and the truth of no self. So that's another aspect of Buddhism that finds immediate links with Shankara also. So here's Keiji Nishitani. He's one of the more famous representatives of the Kyoto school. And he says, quote, Eckhart says that the soul finds its spring of eternal life incessantly gushing up out of itself in the desert of the Godhead, in the nothingness that lies beyond even the being of God, the nothingness that is the field of absolute death of the soul. So samsara is nirvana, being is nothingness, death and life, it's all intertwined in this world of non-duality as understood in Buddhism. I hope this is not too complicated for those of you who don't know the Buddhist tradition or the Hindu tradition out of which it comes, but it gives you a little taste of those kind of analogies.
Yes, I'm listening.
So that's Nishitani. Let's see. Then turning to the Jewish tradition, of course, the idea of non-duality is maybe not that mainstream in Judaism. However, there are also non-dual strands in the mystical traditions of Judaism, in Kabbalah and Hasidism. And so Martin Buber, early on in his career, had a fascination also for Eckhart. And he writes to a friend at a certain point, since 1900, I had first been under the influence of the German mysticism from Meister Eckhart to Angelius Silesius, according to which the primal ground, again, the Urgrund of being, the nameless impersonal Godhead, comes to birth in the human soul. Then I had been under the influence of Kabbalah and of Hasidism, according to which man has the power to unite the God who is over the world with the Shekinah, the reality of God dwelling in the world. In this way, there arose in me the thought of a realization of God through man. Man appeared to me as the being through whose existence the absolute, resting in its truth, can gain the character of reality. So here you see, his emphasis on the analogies or the similarities between Kabbalah and Meister Eckhart's thought. Later on, he changes his mind and he starts to say, but in fact, he came to realize that Jewish mysticism is completely unique in its emphasis on ethos or on the ethical life. So he shifts away from this notion of the similarity of all mystical paths to more of an emphasis on the uniqueness of Jewish mysticism. But at least early on in his career, it was again sort of the idea of non-duality and the non-duality between the divine and the human that struck him. And then finally, Fritjof Schuon. I don't know if my Muslim friends here will regard him as a fully representative of the Muslim tradition, but at least he focuses also on. He's a Sufi. He's a mystic in the Muslim tradition, and he also focuses on Eckhart, but here less to focus on or less to emphasize the non-duality of the divine and the human, even though he could have gone there, since in Muslim mysticism or in Sufism, there's also a very strong emphasis on the nearness of God to the soul and on the extinction of the self in God and so on. But he focuses more on the non-duality between Muhammad and Christ, and on the non-duality between Christ and everyday believer. And that does resonate also with the idea, another idea of Eckhart that I haven't brought up yet, but is also a constant refrain in his work, the birth of the son and the soul. So mystical realization is sort of a birth of Christ in the soul of the human person. So that could lead to an idea that, you know, the person of Christ is only an exemplar of a realization that is available to each and every one. And that's where Schuon goes with his commentary. Meister Eckhart, he says, has expressed this identity between Christ and Muhammad, Christ and every person, in the following terms. Everything that the Holy Scriptures say about Christ is equally true of every good and divine man. That is to say, of every man who possesses the plenitude of spiritual realization, both in the sense of breadth and height. So here you see where he goes with the idea of non-duality. So you see, all of these thinkers take it in their own way, or go in their own, or interpret it from their own particular perspective. But that's one of the central ideas of Eckhart that has been popular in other religious traditions. A second idea or theme in Eckhart that is taken over is apophaticism. And Eckhart is generally quoted together with Pseudo-Dionysius and Nicholas of Cusa, I think, as one of the prime examples of the apophatic tradition or the tradition in which the divine is named not through affirmation, but through negation. So in a book that many of you probably know, The Mystical Languages of Unsaying by Michael Sells, he devotes whole chapters to Eckhart and compares Eckhart with Ibn Arabi as sort of examples of this approach to the divine through the negation of what God is not, or what the divine is not. And here you have some of the quotes or some passages in which Eckhart speaks of God in these negative terms. He says, the place has no name and no one can utter a word concerning it that is appropriate. Every word that we can say of it is more denial of what God is not than a declaration of what he is. But if God is neither goodness, nor being, nor truth, nor one, then what is he? He is pure nothing. He is neither this nor that. If you think of anything he might be, he is not that. God and the Godhead are as different as heaven and earth. And this notion of God and the Godhead, Gott and Gottheit, that he uses in German is one that is usually very often used to sort of emphasize the transcendence and the unknowability of the ultimate reality itself compared to the God that we pray to, and that is the object of devotion. So beyond the God that is the object of devotion and worship, there is an ultimate reality that cannot be named. And he talks about that as the Gottheit. And here he says, God and the Godhead are as different as heaven and earth. So this negative theology has been taken over mostly by Buddhists, and here in particular by D.T. Suzuki, who is again more or less in the tradition of Kyoto school Buddhist philosophy, but is of course a very famous Buddhist teacher here in the United States. Also, he's one of the people who introduced Zen Buddhism to the United States. And he often uses Meister Eckhart actually to explain Zen. So Eckhart for him offers sort of a very clear exposition of the kind of negation of language that is also part of the Zen tradition. So he says Eckhart tries to get underneath words, as it were, to dig out what is there. Eckhart is doing this all the time in his sermons. He picks out some innocent word from the Bible and lets them disclose an inner act which he experiences in his unconscious consciousness. His thought is not at all in the words. He turns them into instruments for his own purposes. So words are used to sort of get underneath or beyond the use of words in our understanding of God. And so he sees a lot of similarities, in fact, between Meister Eckhart and Zen Buddhism in that regard. And after reading Suzuki, Thomas Merton then also focuses again on Meister Eckhart and says everything that's in Zen is in fact also in Meister Eckhart, was sort of Merton's conclusion. So this is the second topic that other religions have picked up. And then finally, the practice that is at the heart of Meister Eckhart's mysticism, or the notion that's at the heart of the practice of Meister Eckhart, is that of detachment, Abgescheidenheit or Gelassenheit, that he expresses in terms of living without a why, ohne warum. This, he says, in its most radical form, raises us above all desire and prayer for any particular reward, even that of sanctity itself. So for him, that notion of detachment has to be so radical that any kind of intention has to be overcome in this attitude of complete detachment. So I'll read a fairly long quote that I hope will help us understand what he means. He talks about this ground, and he says, out of its inmost ground, all your works should be wrought without why. I say truly, as long as you do works for the sake of heaven or God or eternal bliss, from without, you're at fault. It may pass muster, but it's not the best. Indeed, if a man thinks he may get more of God by meditation, by devotion, by ecstasies, or by special infusion of grace than by the fireside or in the stable, that's nothing but taking God, wrapping a cloak around his head and shoving him under a bench. For whoever seeks God in a special way gets that way and misses God, who lies hidden within. But whoever seeks God without special way gets him as he is in himself. And that man lives with the Son, and he is life itself. If a man asked life for 1,000 years, why do you live? If it could answer, it would say, I live because I live. I live because I live. That is because life lives from its own ground and gushes forth from its own. Therefore, it lives without a why, because it lives for itself. So that notion of living without a why is actually something that came up. Meister Eckhart didn't invent it. It was something that was in the air in the 13th century in mystical life. And Bernie McGinn attributes it to a woman, Beatrice of Nazareth. And Marguerite Porete, of course, was an important influence on Meister Eckhart, and he probably also got some of this notion of living without a why from her. And very interesting, in one of his sermons, or in several sermons, he uses this notion to reverse the relationship between Martha and Mary in the gospel, where normally Mary is seen to have made the better choice by sitting at the feet of Jesus. And Meister Eckhart reverses that and says, no, Martha has actually chosen the better path, because she lives out of her own spontaneity and not with a desire for anything other than just to be there and to serve. So he reverses that relationship between Martha and Mary and prioritizes the kind of spontaneous service that Mary exhibits over Martha, who wants to learn, who has sort of certain aims in mind by sitting at the feet of Jesus. Very interesting kind of reversal. So from the perspective of other religious traditions, it's again mostly Buddhism that has been fascinated by the notion of living without a why. And Keiji Nishitani, for example, sees it as the Christian expression of the Buddhist notion of the death of the ego that is necessary in order to attain to the divine reality. But I find what is particularly interesting is Ueda Shizuteru's comparison between the notion of living without a why and the ox herding pictures in Zen Buddhism. I don't know if you're familiar with the ox herding pictures, but they're pictures that talk about the way in which a seeker tries to attain enlightenment and first goes out and searches for the truth and tries to realize the truth, and the whole process of realization going through the different steps until the famous empty circle of Zen Buddhism, where the difference between the seeker and the experience of realization itself is no longer there. So there's a kind of empty circle. But the last one of the ox herding pictures is one in which the person who has become realized goes back into the marketplace and just lives out of his or her own ground in an attitude of complete selfless spontaneity. And that's the last of the ox herding pictures, and that's what Shizuteru compares with Meister Eckhart's notion of living without a why. For those of you who are familiar with Hinduism, of course, the notion in the Bhagavad Gita of Nishkama Karma, so again, acting without attachment to the fruits of your action in the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 2, that's an important theme that was very inspirational to someone like Gandhi, for example. Or in the Taoist tradition, the notion of Wu Wei is also, of course, analogous, or you can see similarities between that and Eckhart's notion of living without a why. So these similarities in mind, then what do we make of all these similarities? And is Eckhart really a Buddhist sage more than a Christian saint? Or does it point to just universals between religious traditions? This is a question that I want to think about with you. And in fact, Buddhist thinkers, the ones that I have mentioned here, have often said that yes, Eckhart is much more of a Buddhist than a Christian. No. He's much more a Buddhist than a Christian, and Eckhart really, says Nishitani, Eckhart really can only be understood through in the light of Buddhism. He says, Nishitani, no doubt what he has to say is markedly distant from Orthodox Christian faith, and it is not without reason that he was regarded as heretical in his own times, despite his considerable influence. And D.T. Suzuki was also saying that, yes, Meister Eckhart, he's really a very unusual Christian. He's an extraordinary Christian. He's totally unique in the Christian tradition, and he's really much more of a Buddhist than a Christian. So what we see in these Buddhist thinkers is an attempt to take Meister Eckhart into their own tradition and make him into a Buddhist. Of course, what they look at for in Meister Eckhart's teaching is what resembles Buddhism. So in terms of how they use Meister Eckhart is just to reinforce what they already believe to be the truth. And everything that may deviate from Buddhist teachings, they haven't touched. So it's not surprising that they then say that Meister Eckhart is actually more Buddhist than than Christian. But still, I mean, it's interesting. So in that famous bull that was pronounced in 1329 by Pope John the 22nd, 2 years after Eckhart's death, in which these 28 articles are condemned, some of the articles that are condemned are indeed the articles that are close to what I just quoted in terms of the similarities with other religions. So the 11th article says, whatever God the Father gave to his only begotten Son in human nature, he gave all this to me. I expect nothing, neither union nor sanctity, but he gave the whole thing to me, just as he did to him. So this is a quote from Meister Eckhart that the bull says it is heretical. So Eckhart himself has never been condemned as a heretic, but just these articles sort of have a taste of heresy. So there's slight difference there, I guess. The 22nd article, the Father gives birth to me, his Son, and the same Son. Everything that God performs is one. Therefore, he gives me, his Son, birth without any distinction. So that's also declared heretical. The 26th article, all creatures are one pure nothing. I do not say that they are a little something or anything, but that they are pure nothing. So again, this article is declared heretical. So what do we make of that? Those are precisely, the articles that resemble other traditions, or that other traditions have been attracted to. And I'll just give some responses by some of the Christian experts in Eckhart. So McGinn himself points out that Eckhart, in fact, himself always tried to remain faithful to the Christian tradition, and that he was always willing to change his mind if he was declared heretical. That's one thing to remember. But he also says, the opinion seems to be growing among responsible modern historians of medieval spirituality that the judgment of Inagro Domenico was in part at least unsound, and that in particular, if the commissioners had had a better knowledge of the fathers of the church, both Eastern and Western, they would have perceived that they too had taught some of what Eckhart was now being condemned for teaching. So that's McGinn's opinion. Interestingly, David Tracy, also, fascinated by Eckhart and notes all the similarities between Eckhart and Buddhism. He talks, David Tracy, about, quote, Eckhart's Buddhist-like recommendation to live a life without why, ono warum, and then his call for a radical detachment that opened to a Godhead beyond God, with some affinities to Buddhist Shunyata. And he remarks that when Eckhart proclaims a vision of Leben ohne Warum as a model for the self, which is almost no self, he's far indeed from the responsible self of the prophets and far from the agapic, erotic self of Christian love mystics. So in one way, Tracy seems to suggest that Eckhart is going in that direction, but then he says, however, we must always remember that Eckhart's thought was ultimately dialectic. And so that whatever he says that seems to be more similar to other religions was part of his dialectic thinking. A famous scholar of Hinduism, R.C. Zehner, who's a Catholic, believed actually that the condemnation of Eckhart was justified. And he believes that, that there has to be a difference between theistic and non-theistic mysticism, and that the non-theistic mysticism of Meister Eckhart was actually heretical. However, he also points out that Eckhart cannot be fully identified with Shankara insofar as he still refers to a Trinitarian God, affirms the need for an ethical life, and recognizes the radical transcendence of God. So he's sort of on the fence between a condemnation of Eckhart and not. My former colleague at Boston College, Louis Roy, has also written a book on the Japanese philosophical reception of Meister Eckhart, and points also to all the similarities between the two traditions, but then he also emphasizes the difference, and in particular, the difference that grace makes in Christianity. So in Buddhism, that notion of grace is not present, and that is a major distinction. And then finally, I want to quote from a book by Jan van Bracht and Paul Mommaers, who wrote a book, Mysticism, Buddhist and Christian. And here's their quote: "Seen from the standpoint of Buddhist-Christian dialogue, Eckhart is indeed an asset insofar as the feeling of affinity with Eckhart on the Buddhist side engenders a more general feeling of affinity with Christianity. But an Eckhart cut off from the Christian main line and pulled into the Buddhist camp, Eckhart captivus, is no longer able to represent Christianity, nor can he constitute a challenge to Buddhist ideas. And this is unfortunate, since mutual challenge is the salt of interreligious dialogue." So I think that sort of captures some of what other Christians also believe about the way in which Eckhart sometimes is being used by Buddhism. However, I think there's also, something to learn for sure from the way other religions have used Eckhart, and in particular, just the fact that Eckhart has been so popular outside of Christianity has led to a revival of Eckhart within the Christian tradition. So Christians who may have been attracted to the non-dualism or apophaticism or detachment of other religious traditions have also come to realize that these kinds of ideas can be also found in the Christian tradition itself. So in that sense, I think Eckhart has also helped Christians to rediscover some of the richness of the Christian mystical tradition. And I think, in addition to that general revival of Eckhart, some of the ideas that maybe in Christianity have been forgotten or neglected, such as living without a why, is not something that has been part of catechesis, I think, for the most part, or of Christian spirituality, and is a very rich and powerful idea. And Bernie McGinn, for example, puts it well when he says that what this notion does is it heightens the ante by inviting the hearer to aim for total spontaneity at every moment, the now that is all moments spontaneity, all moments simultaneously. So what it does is it challenges us to live this life of complete detachment in every moment in our life, in a way that is not often cultivated or advanced in Christian catechesis and tradition. And I think it also helps to overcome the difference between the active and the contemplative life in Christianity. And I give here an example of Dorothy Zoller, who's not a Catholic, but inspired also, of course, she was a very famous liberation theologian and peace activist. And when she got despondent about the lack of success of her peace activism, she says this: but the rose has no why and has to do some things ono warum. Even if they meet with no success now, there's an inner strength of being at peace that cannot make the goal orientation of action the measure of things. All nonviolent action in a violent world participates, in a sense, in the without a why of the rose. So it's a beautiful way of accepting sort of the reality of life and an expression of detachment of the fruits of her actions in her activism also. So usually this kind of detachment in the Christian tradition has been cultivated behind the walls of monasteries, but I think this is also something that Christians, lay or religious, would profit from this kind of spirituality or this kind of teaching, and how to attain it. So by way of conclusion, I'm I want to say that there are many reasons why Meister Eckhart, of all Christian saints and thinkers, appeals to other religions. Not only does his apophatic theology and anthropology open the way for various possible concrete conceptualizations or interpretations, but his actual spiritual teachings and injunctions also suggest areas of resonance and interconnection with those of other religious traditions. Though he himself was firmly embedded in the Christian tradition, his biblical hermeneutics and interpretation of Christian doctrines and practices tend to de-emphasize those elements which define the uniqueness or particularity of Christianity, or set it apart from other religions. His very spiritual, metaphorical interpretations of the Bible. His spiritual interpretation focuses mainly on the cultivation of detachment, self-abandonment, poverty of spirit, and the dissolution of the self. He does not much insist on the specifics of ritual performance or even on the need for ritual participation as a means of salvation. His theology, as McGinn also notes, is, quote, not passion-centered. He shows no interest at all in lingering on the physical details of Christ's suffering and death. Rather than stressing the unique salvific efficacy of the death and resurrection of Christ, he tends to universalize the meaning of the divinity of Christ as a state of realization that can be and must be achieved by all through the birth of the Son in the soul. The capaciousness of his thought, combined with his highly mystical and apophatic nature, thus prompted Oliver Davies to declare that Meister Eckhart is quote, both heretic and the man from whom God nothing hid. He is Christian pastor and Buddhist sage. Meister Eckhart, it seems, is all things to all people, unquote. So finally, I think we can't but face the question of the meaning of the similarity of saintly characteristics and qualities across religions. And in his Varieties of Religious Experience, William James already spoke of, quote, a certain composite photograph of universal saintliness, the same in all religions, of which the features can be easily traced. And he says these features are, according to James, a sense of being in a wider life than the world's selfish little interests, self-surrender, freedom, and loving and harmonious affections. These qualities certainly stand out in Meister Eckhart's description of the life of holiness. But I would say that they form the basic scaffolding of most mystical paths and traditions. They may indeed serve to argue for the unity of religious traditions. We'll probably talk about this next year, and their saints. But it must be remembered that these are embedded in broader metaphysical, doctrinal, ritual, and ethical contexts, which also color the distinctive conception of sainthood of each tradition. And the distinctive characteristics of sainthood in each tradition, I would say, and of each saint, add structure and color to the picture of sainthood and opens the possibility for mutual edification and enrichment across religious traditions. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments. Sure.
On behalf of all of us, thank you so much, Professor Cornille, for that great lecture. Professor Cornille is willing to take some questions. I would like to challenge perhaps the first question to come from a student. How about one of the students who've heard this talk becoming brave and asking a question? Yeah, Edward.
Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate it. In the front lecture where you kind of talked about this spontaneity of kind of the human spirit and how that can work, how does that conflict with the idea of your original sin and your basically spontaneous passions are tied to sometimes that sin? And I don't know if that question like misunderstood some of the points you made, or if that actually is a conflicting idea with his teachings.
So the question is, how does his notion of living without a why tie in with the Christian notion of original sin. If you just live out of a complete spontaneity within Christianity, you might, be still tangled in the reality of original sin and therefore act sinfully rather than purely in the way Meister Eckhart suggests. Of course, he's not saying that every spontaneous action is a saintly action. So when he talks about living without a why, he talks about living in a state of complete selflessness. So without any self-interest, without any selfish desire. And you can say, the notion of original sin in Christianity is very closely tied with, indeed, self-centeredness, concupiscence, self-centered desire. And Meister Eckhart, calls or advocates a state that can, or believes that it's possible to act from a state of freedom, complete selflessness and spontaneity in that sense. So it's not that he denies that the reality of original sin, and I'm sure it's not sort of something that is achieved from one moment to the next. It requires, of course, years of cultivation and overcoming one's own selfish interests in order to be able to act from that state of complete spontaneity. But good, thank you.
Hi, Dr. Kill. Thank you for that. It was a very beautiful talk and very interesting with all the parallels and everything. And I was just wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the interesting principle of non-duality that you brought up at the beginning. I just found the quotes very, very fascinating, and particularly, I was just wondering, like, what exactly that ground of the soul was vis-a-vis the ground of God. And like, particularly, is it something that belongs to the soul as an individual existing thing, or something that belongs to the soul like as being from God and ordered to God? It just, I guess, as you mentioned, he quotes Augustine a lot, and like the line from Augustine that's become something of a mantra today of like, our souls are restless until they rest in thee, like sort of was echoing in my brain.
Thank you. So his anthropology, in his anthropology, he talks about an uncreated, the uncreated depth of the soul that is one with God. So there is, our self or our soul that is part of our existence, but beneath or beyond that, there is an uncreated soul that is one with God and that is to be realized. So that's how he sees the non-duality, not between us and God as sort of human beings, but insofar as we tap into or realize that uncreated nature, which also has been part of, a lot of debate and discussion around Eckhart's work, whether that's orthodox or not.
I don't know if I missed this in your talk, but I would like to know what other Catholic mystics think of Eckhart. Yeah, just a bit of that.
What other Catholic mystics think of Eckhart? I did mention in the beginning that Tauler and Suso, for example, were directly influenced by Eckhart. They were both his students, and they took a lot from Eckhart. And so Eckhart has, in fact, even if he's not always acknowledged, continued to be an important influence throughout the mystical tradition. And in contemporary times, I mentioned Thomas Merton, and a lot of more contemporary Christian mystical figures are, I think, are very influenced by Eckhart also. So I would say throughout the Christian tradition, he's had an important influence. People like Nicholas of Cusa was also influenced by Eckhart, whether he quotes him or not. So yeah, in spite of his condemnation. Interestingly, what I didn't mention is, so because of Eckhart's popularity, the prior of the Dominican order, and Kathy will probably know more about this than I do, has pleaded to remove the stain of heresy from from Eckhart has pleaded with the Pope to do so. I think it was John Paul II that he did it with, or with Benedict. And the answer from the Vatican was that they didn't need to remove the stain of heresy because he was never condemned as a heretic. So I think we can safely assume that he's recognized as an integral part of the Christian tradition and the Christian mystical tradition.
I think this microphone is not working.
It's not working. It's only working for the Zoom people.
Okay, it's for the Zoom.
It's for the Zoom.
So we have a question over here.
Thank you very much. I think I'm interested in the living without a why principle. And my question would be, how does his principle of living without a why fit into or subvert the incentivization of morality, or even more, the incentivization of salvation, both in the Christian tradition and, even if not explicitly, in other religious traditions?
Mm-hmm. Should I repeat it? So how does living...
Unless people hear. Can other people hear that question?
Yeah. So how does it disincentivize the moral life in Christianity, or the pursuit of salvation in Christianity and in other religious traditions? Eckhart never rejected the necessity of ethical living and the sacraments, but that wasn't the highest pursuit. So those kinds of actions have to be done in order to purify the soul, you can say. But as long as you do these rituals out of your own self-interest, you haven't really reached that state of complete purity, or reached the ultimate ground of living without a why. So as long as you need to progress on the spiritual path, he says, this is all okay, performing the rituals is okay, but it's not the best. It's not the highest goal of the spiritual life. As long as you perform ethical actions in order to be saved, or as long as you perform rituals for your own benefit, you have not attained the highest realization or the highest spiritual goal. So he says pretty radical things also at some points, where he completely denounces people who pray for their own intention or for their own interest. He can be very crass about that at certain points also, but I don't think he says that that's necessarily where everyone is at right now. But on the path towards that state of saintliness, people still have to perform rituals, but the ultimate goal is that state of complete purity of heart, really, or that state of living without a why. So it's not for everyone. I suppose Meister Eckhart was also, he was preaching to religious mostly, not to everyday Christians. So that probably has something to do with it too.
Diana, we have a question from someone who's watching this and appreciating it on Zoom, Professor Diane Stinton. Okay. She asks that you help her understand the theme of detachment in relationship to two aspects of Jesus's own life. First, his sense of mission, and second, this notion in Luke 4 about being anointed to preach the good news to the poor, or about his statement, for instance, I must be about my Father's work in John's gospel. Those were all in his sense of mission, sorry. And number two is, how can you be detached and also have vulnerability and compassion? I'll leave those here because those are two dense questions.
They are dense questions, and I hope that some of what I said with reference to Dorothy Zelle clarifies things. So it's not about a state of indifference towards the world or towards others, but it's a way of committing oneself fully to a life of following Christ without necessarily being invested in success or failure. So that's another that's another way of understanding that living without a why is a way of giving oneself fully while maintaining a state of equanimity in success and failure. So it's another thing that Eckhart repeats often, is to accept anything that comes your way, whether it's suffering or joy. But how it matches with going out and preaching the good news. Eckhart was a preacher. He was a Dominican, and that's sort of that was at the heart of his charism. So I don't think that there's necessarily a contradiction between the two. So I think what it calls for is a state of complete commitment to the task at hand, with a state of humility and spontaneity, and without getting despondent when what one does fails, or without getting proud when what one does meets success. So it's that state of equanimity, I think, that he calls for in whatever it is that we are called to do in life. In the way, I mean, maybe Martha was complaining a bit because Mary wasn't helping out, but still she felt called to serve, and that's sort of what she did. And that's sort of what I think Eckhart also means by living without a why, is that God can be found not only in church, but also in washing the dishes or scrubbing the floor, in doing whatever we are called to do in our daily activity without pride and in a state of spontaneity. That's how I would see it. Oh, that was Diana's question, sorry.
Okay, I'd like to make a comment and then a question. The comment is that it's not very well known that both Karl Rahner, one of the more famous Catholic theologians of the 20th century, and Piet Schonenberg from Holland, Netherlands, they both discovered Hindu non-duality toward their end of their lives, and they wrote about it in a very appreciative way. That's my comment. But my question is this: in this distinction, are you aware of that, by the way?
No.
Okay. And this distinction between God and the Godhead, is Eckhart going so far maybe as implying that maybe we don't really know what God is, whether God is Trinity or not? Is he going so far as to say that?
Some have argued that, but that's not what is suggested. I mean, he keeps, especially in his Latin works, he does come back to Trinitarian thought, and all of his understanding of non-duality is still embedded in a kind of Christian Trinitarian thought. So I don't think he completely denies it, but his writing is, like Tracy says, always dialectical. Or in the end, Zehner says, well, maybe Eckhart wasn't so bad, he was just out to shock. And that's sometimes also a good thing, that we're shocked out of our complacency and try to find sort of a higher or deeper truth.
Thanks for this wonderful talk. My question concerns, I was really fascinated with the themes of non-duality and living without a why. In your understanding, what would the ecclesiological implications of these be if they were heeded? Or what would the implications be for ecclesiology in regards to these two issues? Thanks.
These are big questions. And I'm happy that you find them inspiring. I haven't really thought about it in terms of ecclesiology so much as of, maybe more of the priesthood of believers, that we are all sort of called to a life of complete dedication and spiritual practice that maybe would, in the end, lessen the kind of distinction between ordained and non-ordained members of the church. So if there's one implication for ecclesiology, maybe that's one that I can immediately think of, sort of that if living without a why is just as well realized by the life of spontaneous help and study that you may do, or whatever we are called to do, or serving in a position of leadership, there is no ultimate distinction between the two in terms of their importance for ultimate realization. So maybe all of the sense of distinction between the priesthood and the believers would be lessened if we would follow that kind of principle. That's something that that comes to mind immediately, but I'm sure there are a lot more implications, and if it's of interest to you, I look forward for you to develop that further, maybe.
Thank you so much, Professor Cornille. Certainly you did a wonderful job entertaining us. You're a wonderful person to listen to, very clear. You did a wonderful job informing us. Perhaps most important at a conference like this on holiness and comparative perspectives, you inspired us. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Professor Cornille. I regret to say this to those on Zoom, but we have a great dessert reception right out there. So, but the rest of us are welcome, and thank you to also the folks on Zoom.